Welcome to the California Institute of Integral Studies, and this evening we will hear from a colleague who knows a lot about integral studies, not only because he was dean here for 15 years and professor as well as dean, and taught a wide variety of courses and pioneered in a variety of areas here. But if you look at the title of this evening's talk, and in fact, if you look at the title of the workshop, Spirit, Nature, and Self, you have three terms about which our speaker is, I wouldn't say uniquely, but certainly very significantly well prepared. That is to say that Ralph Metzner knows a lot about the interpenetration of the various levels and modalities of consciousness, the spiritual modalities and the ego and self modalities, and then the whole area of nature and ecology. And if we track his long and distinguished career, the German background and a degree from Oxford and a degree from Harvard, and then all these years in California, we see we're traversing quite a lot of culture as well as geography, and intellectual geography as well. And what I find extraordinary about his work is that it is continually finding new areas, new ways to bring old insights or previous insights to new application. And so his present work has to do with the psychology with respect to ecology or the environment or nature. This is very important because we're all aware of the disaster that we modern Western people have created. But it's not clear that we know in any adequate way why or how we have created such disasters. I mean, how did we get to this, and why do we think that we're now going to change it? Have we changed ourselves sufficiently to change and to change this disaster and to go about things in a different way? Well, with those kinds of questions to the fore, we need a person who is a psychologist to make some shrewd observations and recommendations. But particularly we need a psychologist who is attentive to the varieties and complexities of experience, to the depth of our confusion. And when I think of the depth of our confusion with respect to the self and to nature, then I think among very few individuals, I think very significantly of Ralph Metzner. And so I should say that I'm the president of the California Institute of Integral Studies. My name is Robert McDermott, and so you can imagine why it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce Ralph Metzner, who for so many years, at least 15 years, really embodied what this institute was about. And he continues here and in a variety of projects, developing grants and forms of research in the psychology of ecology. It's hard to say, but it's not hard to hear about or think about, especially when we have such an able leader as we have this evening. So a special welcome to all of you. Thank you.
I would like to explore with you some of the themes that are occupying me at the present time that cover this broad and very confusing field, an interrelationship of field of psychology, philosophy, ecology, the environment. I feel it's important for me to, before I get into the substance of it, to say something about our present situation. You know, while Baghdad is burning, is it appropriate for us to be sitting here discussing nature, preservation of nature? Many people feel that preservation of nature is kind of a luxury. And yet, in a very significant way, it seems to me that the situation in the Middle East is intimately related to and based on the larger disturbance in our relationship as human beings to the natural world. The war, it has often been said, is about oil, or more precisely about access to the profits to be made from oil. Now, what is oil? Oil is a fossil fuel that comes out of the ground, is sort of the main fuel of the industrialized energy society. It's often been said industrialized societies are addicted to fossil fuels. So control of those resources is the underlying dynamic. Control of the money to be made from those resources, the distribution of them, is one of the key underlying dynamics in this war situation in which we find ourselves. What does that reflect? That's part of a much larger pattern. It's not just an event that happens out of context. It's a part of a pattern, a similar pattern in Vietnam, in Korea, in other wars, and in economic competitive relationships that we have among different societies, the societies in the industrialized world and the so-called third world. The relationship of the industrialized northern countries to the so-called underdeveloped countries of the third world is exploitative, as is well known. Domination in order to exploit. Exploit what? Exploit resources, cheap labor, and natural resources such as oil and minerals. It's a parasitical relationship, to use a biological analogy. It's a parasitical relationship. It's also a predatory relationship. One of the things about psychology done from an ecological perspective, or what I'm beginning to call green psychology, is that you look at the interrelationships, the psychic factors within people, and interpersonal factors, intersocial factors between people, groups of people, from a biological point of view, from an evolutionary point of view. Predatory behavior of one species on other species is well known throughout the animal kingdom, and is continued in human interrelationships, where you have societies, groups, tribes, preying on other societies, other groups, tribes. However, there are some significant differences in the kind of predatory behavior we see socially, internationally, interpersonally, and the predatory behavior you see in nature. In nature, the predator-prey relationship tends to be very balanced and homeostatically regulated. Predators like wolves and feed and hunt on the caribou. They tend to take out the caribou that are the older and the weaker through disease, and therefore they actually strengthen the herd. If they become too successful, the herd gets diminished, and then the predators themselves go starve and tend to go extinct. So they can't be too successful, and there's kind of a reciprocal balance between these two. It's a dynamic reciprocal balance, not a static state, but they do tend to keep each other in some sort of check. And anyway, this is one of the fundamental principles of ecology. In human societies, that kind of reciprocal balance seems to have gotten lost. We don't know how to do that yet. And it's one of the interesting things that some thinkers in economics, politics, social relations, sociology are beginning to devote a lot of attention to this concept of sustainability, sustainable development, which is very different from the kind of just rabid economic progress, which is short-term oriented, making as much profit in as short a time, quickest time as possible. So this is an example of a perspective, how a perspective from ecology and biology, evolutionary biology, can shed some light on human behavior. So I just wanted to say about the war situation and to give us a moment to reflect on the fact that the war between people, and this is something that happened to me too, that I used to be more of a war activist, I think, per se, and more focused on nuclear and other forms of war between people, and I began gradually to realize that there's a war that humankind, human beings wage against nature, which is actually much more pervasive than the kinds of wars between people. And it underlies that, a war against the environment, against the animal kingdom, against the plant kingdom, against the elemental realms of air, water, and earth. It's an unconscious war. I don't think people decide to tactically, strategically go ahead and destroy these environments, but because they're pursuing short-term goals of greed, motivated on greed and profit, the effect is one of large-scale destruction of the environment. And as Robert McDermott pointed out, it's the fact of global degradation, increasing global environmental degradation, is forcing in many people all over the world a re-examination of our most fundamental assumptions and presuppositions. And this is what interests me as a psychologist and as a philosopher, and becoming more of an environmental philosopher. I'm still a practicing psychologist as well. So I see the kinds of disturbances in individual people as well as in myself. I'm also interested in reflecting on them philosophically. I'd like to reflect on them with you in a discussion that we might have tonight after our talk, and also for those that want to participate in the workshop. And I might just say briefly, the workshop will consist of some discussion and some experiential processes that I've developed that have the effect of bringing, helping to make us conscious of the nature of the relationship that we have to the non-human natural world on a very personal basis, in a personal way. The three terms in the title of this lecture and workshop are spirit, nature, and self. So what am I trying to get at there is this, that I've come to understand something that I think you'll agree with when I say it, which is that our Western culture, and to some extent also other cultures, and Asiatic culture also, have for many centuries now suffered from a basic dissociative split in consciousness. And people have talked a lot about the split between body and mind, and that's one aspect of it. I would say the split is in a way much more basic. It's seen most clearly in when you think about our conceptions and our ideas about what is spirituality, what is religion, what is spirituality. For most of us, when you think about it, spirituality is somehow seen as very different from, or even in opposition to, nature. There's a classic line in Goethe's drama Faust, in which is sort of a key story of the European psyche, I think, in which he says, two souls live in my breast. One wants to go upward into the ethereal heavens, and one always wants to go down into the earth, into the pleasures of the senses. In the Judaic, the Christian, and the Islamic religions, all the great monotheistic religions that came out of the Middle East, that are focused in their origin as far as in the Middle East, that are being fought around now. The concept of deity is of a transcendent deity. It's a single, male, polarized, masculine, transcendent deity, very far removed from the earth. God is very far away from the earth. Transcendent deity. God had created the earth. And human beings' task is to come to union with God in some way. In order to come to union with God, there's a tremendous gap that has to be crossed. This is we are so imbued with that notion that it's very hard to realize that it is actually an assumption that's not necessarily shared by other people and other cultures. It's not shared by the polytheistic religions of ancient times and of places like India, or the non-theistic religions like Taoism and the most ancient religious traditions on this planet, which are the shamanic traditions, in which all of nature, gods, deities, gods and goddesses are spread throughout nature. This is animism. It means every tree, every mountain, every river, every forest, every lake, fields have nature spirits, gods and goddesses, devas, inherent in them. We can communicate. People communicated with these spirits of nature, spirits of animals. Animals had a great creator spirit that was inherent in every member of the species of animal that the Native Americans would address before hunting the bear or before hunting the buffalo. They would address their prayers to the great buffalo spirit or the great bear spirit, not to that particular bear, but to the spirit, the god of that species, as it were, to ask for permission and apologize for the fact that they had to kill this one animal which they would then use for food. This betokens a profound attitude of respect. And it's interesting to contemplate how different that is from the attitude that we have towards the animal kingdom. I mean, we go to a supermarket and we buy a piece of meat that's wrapped in plastic. I mean, that's very far away from the cow. It has no respect for the cow. Doesn't even hardly has awareness that there was a cow, an animal on four legs, with eyes and breath and feelings, pain, and all those kinds of things. The animal liberation movement that wants to get us away from our addiction to meat, our practices of using animals for scientific research when that's not really necessary, is a very powerful and numerically overwhelmingly large part of the larger environmental movement. I would say actually the animal liberation movement, as far as I can tell, is numerically stronger than all the rest of the environmental movement put together. So our spiritual strivings are defined in the great religious spiritual traditions as going in the opposite direction than nature. Our spiritual strivings mean you pray and you meditate and you try to go up to heaven. And this is true in Asian and the Indian religion too, in yoga. In yoga you meditate, you bring the kundalini up from the base of the spine up to the crown of the head and then up and out. The religion, the Vedic, Vedantist, Upanishadic religion of India is Indo-European religion, although it's polytheistic in its kind of mythological aspect. So in that sense, there's more of a respect towards the multiplicity of spiritual forces in nature than in the monotheistic religions. But still, the same pattern is that spiritual striving involves detaching oneself from nature. Buddhism, it's the same thing. Detach, 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 always. Life is suffering, and the only way to become free of the round of birth and death is to meditate and go into nirvana, which is extinction. Extinction is a phrase used in biology. Extinction of species. Interesting kind of parallel there of concept. But this dissociation from nature is in its most acute form in the monotheistic religion. And there, because there's nothing intermediate, you see, the Judaism and Christianity and Islam eliminated nature spirits because they were so intent. This goes right back to the very beginnings of Christianity, the church fathers like St. Augustine and many of the books of the Old Testament attack and scold and thunder and rail and rant and rave against the people for following these nature spirits. And they say basically all nature spirits are demonic, meaning evil. Christianity and Judaism and Islam demonize nature. The great gods and goddesses of the pre-Christian, animistic, shamanistic religions were demonized and turned into devils. The sacred places, the sacred groves and forests and wells and springs were destroyed, and in some cases chapels, Christian chapels or churches or other temples were built on top of them. The holy days of the old gods and goddesses were overlaid with Christian festivals and saints' days and so forth. Sometimes in many cases, not only is there a split between spirituality and natural being. Nature is down here. It's in the body. It's in the earth. It's kind of messy. You know, the whole mythology of the fall means that nature is tainted. The body is tainted. It's tainted with original sin. It was created by God, but then God is not really there, and the whole emphasis is on the afterlife in Catholicism or in Protestantism too, in terms of doing good works, working hard and self-denial and so forth in order to accumulate merit. There's a definite de-emphasizing and a definite even prohibition against any attempt to directly communicate with God. The old church fathers used to say, you can't communicate with God. God is very far away. He's above all this. So if you think you're communicating with God, you're actually communicating with what they used to call intermediate spirits, spirits that live in the sort of sublunary, as they call it, the sublunary, in the ethers, and those are devils. And the whole concept of the devil became the sort of the chief of all these intermediate spirits. And therefore, this is dangerous stuff. You can't do it. If you think you're doing it, as of course in the old religions of old Greece and Rome and the whole Middle East, the Mediterranean people used to communicate with nature spirits all the time, just like people do now. They do tarot readings and I Ching, and in order to get divination, prophecy, healing, diagnosis of problems, interpersonal problems, and will I have success and all of that, would pray and make offerings and make talismans and astrology, all were specifically listed by this church fathers as consort with demons, to be eschewed, and don't do this, it's dangerous, and you can only do it if you're having a pact with the devil. And that whole tendency climaxed in the Middle Ages, 14th to 15th, 16th, 17th century with witch hunts, which was basically a systematic extermination of the pagan people who adhered to the ancient natural wisdom of healing and shamanic practices of going into altered states of consciousness for purposes of healing. I wanted to just point out some of these basic trends. Sometimes there's a dissociation between spirit and nature, and then there's almost like spirituality. In order to be spiritual, you have to overcome nature. It's almost like they're seen as enemies. In Sufism, you have the notion of the nafs, which are sort of animal impulses that we have. And these are our enemies. In order to reach Allah, we have to overcome, we have to conquer the nafs in ourselves. Notice that this is not that different from Freud's idea. Freud's idea about the id, which means the it, got that idea from George Gradek. It is basically bodily impulses that are not personal. They just sort of come. That sort of it comes over me. It came over me to be angry or sexy or whatever it is. And the task of the ego in psychological development is to control these impulses, which are from the body and which are animalistic. This was Freud's idea of the id. So it's animalistic, kind of threatening. They threaten to erupt out of the unconscious and overpower consciousness and lead one to have uncontrolled kind of antisocial behavior, sexual and aggressive. And the ego needs to learn to mediate that, and whether through direct control, repression. Repression in Freud's view was the price of civilization had to pay in order to overcome the animal past. Again, this couldn't be more different than from the point of view of the ancient cultures of animistic and shamanistic beliefs. Jung's view of the unconscious was much more sanguine, and he saw the unconscious as also the source of creative and positive and inspiring kind of impulses. But on the other hand, the body and animal consciousness is hardly mentioned at all in Jung. It's all becomes very psychic and symbolic, and it's all this kind of symbolic, mental, imaginative realm. The body is hardly ever mentioned in Jung's voluminous writings. Very, very minor references to it here and there. But it is clear that in Jung's view, of course, the archetypes basically come down to and are anchored in the body, but he never really developed that idea. Some people have since then developed it a little bit further. And these are all, I'm just going to touch on some of these topics that we can go into in more depth in tomorrow's workshop and maybe later on. I also want to show you some slides that illustrate these points, so I'm just going to go very rapidly and touch on some of these other points. So we have the notion that's also been put forward by some ecologists of the arrogance of humanism. The arrogance of humanism, by and large, in Western culture and Western thought, the human is in an attitude of arrogance towards the natural world. We're above all that. You know, we have to be above it. We have to exert our. And there's that whole myth of domination. We have to control nature. We have to subdue nature. It's often led back to certain statements in the book of Genesis, which theologians have argued about what they really mean, and so forth. And certainly different interpretations can be given to them. But no doubt it does say you should go out and subdue the world, and have dominion and subdue. This has been taken in many quarters as a license to do exactly with nature as we please. This gets us back to resources. The deep ecologists say when you think about nature as a bunch of resources, you're coming from an anthropocentric or homocentric point of view. It's like the assumption is that the whole natural world exists for humans. In a way, the Bible reads like that. You know, God created humans, and it was like his most magnificent creation, and all the animals and the plants kind of parade in front of Adam, and it's like they're all there for Adam and Eve, and we can do with them what we want. And this has been, again, this couldn't be more different when you look at the ancient animistic and shamanistic traditions, where we're seen as part of the natural world. We're seen as one animal species among others. Human beings were said to be able to communicate with animals. Now, it's important to realize that those traditions, those shamanic and animistic beliefs about the world are much, much older than these others. I mean, Christianity is a couple of thousand years old. Judaism, probably another 2 or 3 thousand beyond that. And the Indo-European traditions, which basically brought in the notion of patriarchal social systems, dominated patriarchal social systems, and male sky gods, in contradistinction to the earlier religions that had a female earth goddess. So they were still shamanic, but you already had a certain amount of this warfare going on between, it was almost like a warfare between heaven and earth. You know, the sky gods tended to be warrior gods, and there's a lot of legitimate, mythological and religious legitimation of warfare and predation and domination. But even that tradition goes back to about 4000 BC at the most, so 6,000 years. Before that, you have hundreds of thousands of years back to the beginning of the human species, 1 million or 2 million years ago. Hunter-gatherer existence where a completely different relationship existed. Now, I'm not, and nobody else that I know is advocating that we go back to living as hunter-gatherers, or even living as pre-Christian animists, and throwing away Christianity and Judaism and all these traditions have contributed essential and valuable parts to what we are at the present time. But what I do believe is that in arriving at this point, we have overlooked certain things. We have forgotten certain aspects of our culture, of our world, that we desperately need to get back to. It's my belief that this dissociation of human consciousness from the rest of the matrix of natural life is the most disastrous underlying factor in our present situation. And I see the environmental movement, the ecology movement, the peace movement, the feminist movement, the difference between developed and third world countries. All of these go back to this disastrous life out of balance, as the Hopis call it. So what we're looking at is worldviews, basic worldviews. People are talking about environmental ethics, having an environmental ethic, meaning considering what are our values, what are our values and our ethics vis-a-vis the environment. What are the implicit, the unconscious values and ethics that we hold? The industrialized society conventional view holds an unconscious value that nature exists purely for human use. It's an unconscious assumption that human nature has no value other than its use for us. The deep ecologists, connecting back to the old shamanic and animistic traditions, say, no, that's an anthropocentric, homocentric arrogance. Nature, animals, plants, mountains, rivers have inherent value or intrinsic value in themselves. They have a right to exist without being exploited, used, or dominated or polluted by us, or only in an extent where, in a way that is balanced and sustainable. I mean, nobody says we can't kill animals. We kill animals. As killing of animals and killing of plants is a natural part of life. But there's a way of doing it that's balanced and a way of doing it that's imbalanced, not sustainable. So we're talking about worldviews. See, values and ethics come from worldviews. So what I want to look at with you, in terms of looking at slides, is some different worldviews that we've held. It's actually two kind of related concepts. Worldview, what the Germans call Weltbild, the picture that we have of the world, and then what the Germans call Weltanschauung, which is more like the attitude, the perspective, the relationship that we have to the world. Like an exploitative attitude or an anthropocentric attitude of domination is an aspect of attitude. It doesn't really say anything about the world picture itself. So if you will follow me here for a while we look at these slides and think about these things, I'd like you just to consider the fact of what is our worldview and what is our world attitude, and what are some possible alternatives that might be less destructive and more constructive and more contributive to a better life for all. There you have, it's like a man going into an altered state of consciousness, expanding his consciousness from the conventional world of the village and the houses and the sun and the moon, and he's suddenly breaking through into this other realm. And we live in a time when stupendous and extraordinary discoveries are being made about the universe, and practically every week in the paper you see cosmologists and astronomers making some new astounding discoveries that can't be explained and have been previously completely unheard of. And the same is true of the inner world. Incredible explorations and discoveries being made about outer space and inner space at the same time. And this feeling of breaking through the boundaries of the hitherto known conventional world is a feeling that's both scary and exciting and exhilarating at the same time. So here is the icon of the 20th century. This is one of the key factors that is different now than it's ever been before. We've been able to destroy the environment before, and destruction of environment has happened before, including in very ancient times. And what we've done is simply moved on to another part of the environment. Now we have one world. This picture represents and symbolizes the moment in which the consciousness of Gaia, the earth, becomes reflective of itself as a unified totality. This is what Gaia consciousness means. It means that not only this human being and this animal and this plant and perhaps this mountain and the river is alive, but the whole world is one living unity. The whole world is like a giant superorganism in Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which is the hypothesis says just that the world is not just a ball of rock hurtling through space, but the whole thing, including the atmosphere, the oceans, are all functioning in a homeostatic interactions that the atmosphere is created by life. The composition and chemical composition of the oceans and so forth are all generated by life in an interactive processes. The atmosphere, Lovelock says, the atmosphere is to the planet the way the shell of a snail is. It's just as much part of the organism. It's not just an envelope around it. It's extruded by life on Earth. So the whole thing is alive. And again, in these pictures, one can get a clear sense of this living and organism that is the Earth, with the swirling clouds. And many of you may have read or seen the statements of the astronauts that have become quite mystical and lyrical in their effusive descriptions of the kind of visions that they had as they looked back on the Earth, on the living Earth. And the sense of fragility and vulnerability of the life, and how everything is interconnected, and how the clouds and the atmosphere swirling around seems to be like the breath that animates the whole thing. And this is an ancient view, and that's why Lovelock called his theory the Gaia theory, because it did connect in strictly modern scientific language to ancient ideas of somehow the whole thing is alive. He doesn't say the Earth is a goddess, because he's a scientist and doesn't want to make that kind of a statement. But at least he makes a step that the whole thing is alive, and then and is behaving like a giant organism. And then that notion, you know, of the Earth as like a super giant organism is it's an analogy, but like many analogies, it can be very useful. So it's a world picture, and it's a very radical departure from the world picture that science actually in the first half of the 20th century sort of bequeathed to us. The world picture of science that came out of the scientific revolution in the 17th century is of the world and the universe is a mechanistic picture. The whole world is a mechanism. There are these laws of nature that were created by God and set into motion by God. It's a dead and lifeless mechanism. Except then you have the problem of explaining, well, how did life arise? But life arose then, in the mechanistic worldview, life arose as a result of random permutations of chemicals. And then consciousness somehow arises in the human species only, in some mysterious way as an epiphenomenon. Nobody really knows exactly how. Again, this is a world picture, and pictures like this and the Gaia theory, and which is why the Gaia theory is such a major departure, because it marks the strongest statement so far to come out of science that says the very fundamental assumptions, the most fundamental assumptions of the world picture are mistaken or need to be revised. A picture of the sun to realize that our world picture has been, to remind ourselves, a world view that we have from science has been that, again, not only that we have a planet that's somehow isolated, the Earth and the sun are intimately interrelated. Many of these things are things that we know, if we think about science, and we can read it in high school textbooks and so forth, but do we really feel what that really means? So, and supposing we even accept the notion that the Earth is a living organism, so now we're living on this living Earth, and yet What does that then mean about the sun and the solar system? The Earth itself is part of a larger system. The Earth is intimately connected with the sun. Does that mean the sun is also a living organism, or the entire solar system? Again, certainly the ancients thought so. The ancients said the sun is a god. Egyptians, Greeks, all ancient peoples deified the sun. We say deified, saying they made it a god. They didn't. That was not their view. They didn't make it a god. They saw, experienced it as divine, which is very different. We do know from science that life on Earth is intimately coupled with the sun. It couldn't exist without the sun. So psychologically, we're Earth beings, but it would be equally accurate to say we're solar beings. And there's some interesting connections there to astrology that we can explore in the workshop tomorrow if you want to. Because astrology has everything to do with the relationship between the Earth and the sun. And you might say that the human being has an Earth part and a sun part. Some people might say, as an analogy, that the ego or the personality or the body is like the Earth, and the spirit is like the sun. The spirit is like the sun. We're all spiritual suns. Another ancient mythic and mystical tradition or symbolism. And not only are we related to the sun, we're also related to the moon. So there's a polarity of sun and moon, usually as a male-female polarity, but not universally. Usually it's the sun is experienced as a masculine deity, the moon as a female deity. The moon is believed to connect with water and the female cycle and the tides and of course the night. The sun and the moon seems to exert this kind of magnetic pull, whereas the sun is a very dynamic kind of radiative energy that streams down on the earth that seems to trigger or catalyze chemical reactions and reactions on the earth in a more masculine way, is the usual assumption, but it's not always that way. And then the sun and planets in the solar system are itself part of an even larger whole, the galaxy. This is the Andromeda galaxy, but our galaxy is called the Milky Way galaxy. Interesting term. That's the technical term for it, Milky Way. It refers back actually to an old mythology of the cosmic mother, according to which myth the stream of stars constituting the Milky Way are like the streaming milk from the breasts of the cosmic mother. So in many ancient cultures, a child is born by coming down to earth. The ancients believed that when a child is born, he descends down through the planetary spheres, the 8 planetary spheres, and Saturn is the outermost, and Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Earth. And at each planetary sphere, it takes a quality from that planet, and these are then blended together to make up the constitution of the personality, which you can read off from the constitution of the planets at the moment of birth. This was the old astrological idea. But the basic notion is that birth is a descent to earth from a spiritual world. We come down to this earth plane from a spiritual world. That's the underlying pattern. And then the pattern of transcendence or spiritual development involves going in the opposite direction, see, ascending back up to the spiritual world. Also, this happens at death. At death, you go back up into the spirit worlds, which are somehow above. So I'm not concerned at this point with trying to decide whether these views are correct or true, or to me, they all have some aspects of the truth, but I want to more just get at the basic patterns and see some of these similarities and resemblances and analogies between patterns in different areas. So maybe the experience that we descend down through the earth somehow is related to the experience that we have when we descend down from the womb and through the birth canal and sink down to earth, from this place where we're contained in this kind of cocoon-like existence. So in the alchemical tradition, where which bipolar mythologies are very strong, so heaven and earth, you have sun and moon as one kind of male-female polarity, and heaven and earth is another one. Heaven is masculine, earth is feminine. Earth is, because in the oldest religions, earth gives birth. The earth mother is the mother that gives birth to everything. In the later traditions, alchemy is a relatively late tradition. It's post-Christian, has a lot of Christian elements in it, kind of a blend between classical mythology and Christian and Hellenistic themes. Earth is often seen as the nurse. Of course, the earth is the nurse. We get nourished from the fruits of the earth. And allusions to ancient stories, Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus were raised by a wolf. Relationship with animals, intimate, familial relationships with animals are pervasive throughout all classical mythologies. So, in the previous one, the earth, his nurse is the earth. Now, who is this his? Or sometimes it's its nurse. It's the being being reborn, the spiritual being being reborn. And this is it's interesting, the wind carried him in its belly. What does that mean? It's kind of a counterintuitive, the male form carrying the fetus. Now the wind, like air, the symbolism of wind and air, which is masculine, is the symbolism of mind. Earth is a symbolism of body. Air is a symbolism of mind. Water is a symbolism of feeling. And fire is the symbolism of vision and imagination and perception and spirituality. So every process of growth or development starts with an idea in the mind. Before you can become enlightened, you'd have to have the idea that you can become enlightened, right? An idea is a concept. Every birth is preceded by a conception. Think about the parallel between a concept and a conception. The Australian Aboriginals dream their children before they are conceived and they're born. Many people have had the experience of having a dream or a vision that they're going to have a child before the child is conceived. So the idea is conceived in the mind. The earth, the physical flesh of plant and animal, is what nourishes and embodies it and incarnates it, brings it to fruition or fruiting. So here an image of this cosmic mother streaming stars from her breast, and two aspects of the male, the king and the alchemist, different planetary glyphs on her body, representing the body of the universe. See, the earth is a body, but the whole universe is also a body in these old traditions. So this is Blake's view of Newton. See, Newton was regarded by Blake as the one who really created and originated the mechanistic worldview, which he called the single vision of Newton's sleep. So he talked about a fourfold vision, but then it gets reduced to the single vision because it's single because it only sees the material world of material objects, what some people refer to as the billiard ball world of atoms and so forth, interacting according to mechanical laws. This was, of course, Newton's great contribution, his great gift in terms of being able to formulate the mathematical laws of the mechanism of mechanical forces. There's nothing wrong with a mechanistic model. The distortion comes in when we think that the model is what the world is. We make the model, and then we see only that which fits into the model, and we've lost the fourfold vision. You know, Blake says, I walk down the street and I see a thistle, but I don't really just see the thistle, I see an old man. And then the threefold vision is a nighttime kind of feeling thing. Fourfold vision is a spiritual vision. So there's many aspects of vision, many levels of consciousness, you might say, many dimensions of reality that the Newtonian mechanistic worldview has deprived us of, if we take that worldview as being the reality, rather than, and forget that it's merely a model among other possible models. So here's another image from medieval India of the world as a person. So you have this notion of the world, there's this correspondence, what was sometimes called the macro-micro correspondence, macrocosmos, microcosmos. So the human being is like a mini cosmos, and the cosmos is like a giant being. The Purushottama, the great person, the cosmic person, the Adam Kadmon, the Kabbalists called it. So the Adam Kadmon, or this cosmic person, then is portrayed in images like this, and has the sun and the moon are the two eyes, that kind of thing. And then it has an axis and has the different chakras, just like an individual person has different chakras, so the cosmic person has different chakras. And in the middle of what would be the middle of the body, there's what's called the world navel, right around where in the body the navel is, and this was called the world navel. And this central axis was then, because it's like a tree with many branches, was then sometimes also referred to as a tree or as a mountain. And the world, when you think about it, does have an axis. You know, the world is a globe that rotates on its axis. So it does have an axis, just like the human being has an axis. So there is a correspondence. It's not just a fanciful kind of image, there is a correspondence. Of course, the world isn't a human being with a head and two eyes and two arms. It's a globe, but it does have an axis. And it may have certain other pattern analogies and similarities that are worth looking at. So this is an image of 28,000 years ago from the pre-Indo-European, pre-Christian, pre-Indo-European cultures of old Europe that were earth goddess worshipping cultures. These are the cultures that the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas has done so much to rediscover and describe and decode their language and their symbolism. They often have these features of having the breasts and the buttocks and the abdomen emphasized, these very round kind of forms swelling with life, bursting with life, as if the facial features, the arms and legs are not really that important. It's kind of interesting because some people have pointed out it's almost more like a globe, you know. It's almost, by diminishing the arms and legs and the details of the face, you're turning this female figure almost into a round globe, much like the earth. Maria Gimbutas says the reason that these forms are emphasized like that, you know, this is not grotesque. These people, it's not that these people didn't know how to do a naturalistic, they could very easily have done a naturalistic sculpture of a female if they had wanted to. But they chose to do it that way because they chose to emphasize symbolically those features that were most directly expressive of the life force in its birth-giving qualities. And then there are other images that emphasize more of the death-dealing qualities, because the goddess both gave birth to all forms of life, but then also took all forms of life back into herself in death. So the world or nature as a mother is, we've had three or four images already, world images. The world as a mechanism, the world as a person, the world as a superorganism, which is a modern kind of Gaia view, and the world as a mother. Native Americans speak of Earth Mother. We still speak colloquially of Mother Nature. Observing animal mothers in particular, I think for our ancestors who, before they discovered the connection, particularly before they discovered the connection between sexuality and birth, which would have come relatively late after all, it's not an obvious connection. So there were hundreds of thousands of years where that was not understood. And so it seemed like women just produced living forms out of themselves, mothers, animal mothers, produced these living beings out of themselves in this totally miraculous way. So bear is the most ancient and most powerful and revered of animals among the ancient hunter-gatherers of the northern hemisphere in particular. So bear mother would have been and was one of the primary icons of the world as an animal mother, a mammal mother, a monkey mother, primate mother, or primate cousins. So here a reconstruction of somewhere along the line of the long path from hominid apes to ape-like humans, the various stages in between. So one of the lessons we learn from an ecological, psychological point of view, psycho-ecological point of view is if we stop treating animals as something to simply be used and exploited, or conquered, or overcome, or eliminated, or defended against, or something threatening, we realize that we are animals. You know, we descended from these. This is another one of these things that we know, but how often do we ever really actually feel it? I would venture to guess that many people are quite uncomfortable with the notion that we are animals. You know, so much emphasis is put on trying to decide, well, what makes us different? Meaning, what makes us better? Somehow we must be better. We couldn't just be mere animals. Or we say of somebody who's being brutal or insensitive, they're animals, they're nothing but animals. This is actually, when you think about it, a tremendous insult to our relatives, and certainly native cultures would see it that way. Human beings treat each other with a brutality that animals are not capable of. I mean, animals are violent in terms of hunting and killing for food, but they don't kill for sport. Animals don't kill each other for sport. They're not given to mass extinction of others. They're not given to racism, or they don't hunt their own species. They don't prey on their own species. Members of the species may compete, but they don't kill each other. So traditional cultures then recognize the fact that science teaches us, which are that the animal species are the ancestors of the human species. And traditional people also recognize and respect our human ancestors much more than we do, and maintain the connection with human ancestors because they believe that you can communicate with ancestors that have died. Most of us don't believe this, don't believe that it's possible to communicate with the dead, therefore we cut ourselves off from our own ancestral wisdom. It's not that these cultures worship the ancestors, it's not animal worship, ancestor worship, it's ancestor respect and it's communication with. And then a recognition that the animals are also our ancestors. So if we do that, and this is one of the things we'll explore in the workshop tomorrow, we have the entire evolutionary story coded in our genes, in our body structure, and the functions and structures, the tissues, bones, and flesh of our body. Because our body is the end result of 5 billion years of the evolution of life, or 500 million years of animal life, whenever animals first appeared. So it's an interesting exercise to go back in time and go, what did we learn? You know, where did we come from? What was our story as a human beings? What was our story? The importance of really trying to understand human origins. And that's why I think paleoanthropology, paleontology, prehistory, all these things are incredibly interesting, not out of mere academic or scientific curiosity, but because it's our story. We traveled that journey. So what was it like living in the savannah, in the open savannah after coming down from the trees? We did that for millions of years, much, much longer than, you know, recorded history. So I mentioned earlier the image of sky gods. 80% of heaven and earth mythology has male sky gods and female earth goddesses. But there are a lot of female sky goddess mythology as well. The Lady of the Moon, or Inanna, the Queen of Heaven. So it's equally interesting and provocative and stimulating to think about those polar images that are different than the ones that we're used to. Very interesting Egyptian myth in which the earth is a god, Geb, and the sky is a goddess, Nut, and Geb and Nut are engaged in intercourse, and the process of creation is accomplished by the god standing on the right there, whose name I believe is Shefnut, who separates the cosmic pair having intercourse and lifts the sky up into the and lets the earth come down. King Neptune, and again, mostly earth and water are feminine. In alchemy, in most native traditions, it's Mother Earth, Grandmother Ocean. The energies of earth and water are feminine, they sink down, they're receptive, downward sinking. Fire and air are upward rising, masculine energies. But again, not always, like in King Neptune or Poseidon, the sea god. But here in this image from the Afro-Brazilian tradition of the Orishas, in which there's the sea goddess Iemanjá, most popular goddess and deity in Brazil. So again, one of the old European goddess figurines from about 20,000 to 25,000 years ago, with the breasts and buttocks emphasized tremendously. From Eastern Europe, most of these cultures flourished around the 10th, 9th, 8th, and 7th millennium BC in the area of Yugoslavia, Greece, the Balkan countries, Hungary, Bulgaria, all these countries. And these tend to be small figurines. Some of them fit into the palm of your hand, or just 6 inches tall. They would be like votive figurines set up in altars in the houses. Not separate temples, but in the houses. And many of them having features of animals, like this one, a bear head, snake heads, or snake body, or bird heads are very common. Hedgehogs, mammals, frogs, bears, bulls. Snake and bird are amongst the most frequent, sometimes both. So these images showing that the goddess was not only human, or conceived of in human form, but had the form of animals and plants and mixed forms. So a tremendous sense of interconnectedness of all aspects of the natural world, all aspects of the natural world being regarded as holy or sacred, in such a way that even the distinction between sacred and non-sacred doesn't really make sense. If you regard everything as sacred, then you don't make a distinction. You know? It's only if you declare certain places like churches or temples as sacred and others not so, then you're into a kind of a dualistic realm. From India, a goddess with a snake body. The goddess often associated with snake and tree, particularly, contradistinction to the Freudian idea that the snake is a phallic symbol. The ancient cultures actually almost universally had the goddess and her priestesses holding or carrying or being snakes or part snakes. So this is a map that shows some of the wanderings of the people that came from the Indo-European people, that also referred to as the Kurgan waves. These were the nomadic pastoralists who worshipped sky gods, male sky gods, and who established patriarchal dominator systems. They came from Central Asia and wandered down into the Middle East and into India as well as then Europe, Eastern Europe, and all the way into Western Europe, the Germanic and Celtic people going all the way to British Isles. So among the Germanic people, the Indo-European people that lived in Europe before the Christian era, the image of the world was that of a tree. I mentioned before the tree, the axis, so the world tree. So this is another world picture. The world tree is the central axis in which everything in life hangs together. Some Native American visions had that image also. If you've read the story of Black Elk, you'll remember in his great cosmic vision where he sees a tree which everything in the world is kind of connected to that. It's a very unifying symbol or image. And not only this tree of the Nordic, Scandinavian and Germanic myths had 3 worlds, or sometimes 9 different worlds of spirits and gods and giants and dwarves and humans, all connected to it. But 3 main worlds that you can see here at the root of the tree. This was the underworld, where there were the 3 old goddesses who were the 3 Norns, the 3 goddesses of fate. Then the middle world was called Midgard, the middle world, which is where humans live. This is our world. And then the crown of the tree was Asgard, the god, the garden of the sky gods, who came from Asia. And then there's a giant serpent that winds around in the middle world. And there's the rainbow bridge, by means of which the gods can go from the upper world to the lower world, because the gods also go to the lower world. They meet there at the root of the tree, and they meet there in council. And there are snakes, a snake that gnaws away at the root of the tree throughout the ages and keeps gnawing away, and then at the end of the age of the gods, then finally the tree begins to fall down, and the serpent has been gnawing away at it, and that then is called the twilight of the gods. And it's another image of this. There you see the 3 Norns spinning the threads of fate, one that begins the thread each life, and they control the fates not only of humans but of gods as well. One begins life, one controls the extent of life, and then one ends it at the end, cuts it off at the end. And there's a serpent gnawing away, and there's deers and other animals, and squirrel running up and down, and then a bird, an eagle, and other birds at the top of the tree. And here from Indonesia, a Buddhist image of worshippers adoring the tree. Of course, the tree plays a major role in many Indian mythology, but also in Buddhist mythology, because the Buddha sat under the bo tree when he attained his enlightenment. It's interesting to see that sometimes trees do have these very feminine kind of, like a tree with breasts. Very easy to see how tree images became associated with this incredible fertility, fruitfulness, nourishment, protection, life-giving force. There's a tremendous kind of symbiotic, mutually reciprocal, supportive relationship between humans and trees. Now, the human nervous system is a tree, especially clearly visible if you turn it upside down, where the brain would be the root, and then the stem down the vertebra, and then the branches. It has that branching structure. You have a central stem, and then large branches going up from that, and smaller branching. This branching tree structure is a basic form in nature. You see it in leaves, you see it in rivers, you see it in trees, you see it in the body, not only in the nervous system, in the arterial blood system, the bones, and so forth. And in terms of the tree being inverted, it is interesting that there are some mythologies, particularly in the Kabbalah and in Hinduism, that say that the tree of life is inverted, meaning that the root is above, meaning that we come from above. See, that ties us back to the old idea that we come from the spirit world. So in the Kabbalah, the root of the tree is in the Ein Sof, the infinite, and then the Sephirothic tree branches down into the earth, and the foundation of the tree is Malkut is in the earth, or on the earth, or in the earth. You can see that the sensory nerves of the nervous system are like going to the surface, are like the outermost branches and leaves of a tree that pick up sensations and stimuli of light and pressure and water and so forth. So there's the tree that's at the origin of the whole Western Judeo-Christian trip. Look at the expression on their faces, particularly, you see. Eve has this kind of very serene, inviting, calm expression, and Adam is sort of scratching his head, trying to figure it all out, What am I getting myself into here? What does this all mean? Should I or shouldn't I? We're still asking that question. And many scholars now believe, and I think this is essentially correct, that the story as it is in the Bible is a very a mixture, a blend of at least two layers of stories that are very closely interwoven, almost line by line in the story. And the later layer, which is the layer of the Hebrew priests that put together the book of Genesis, is like an overlay over the older layer of the old goddess religion, in which the goddess, through the women priestesses and through the serpent, was the initiator. The serpent initiated the woman initiated the man, the goddess initiated the serpent, conveying the evolutionary wisdom. What is the serpent is the evolutionary wisdom. We have the reptilian brain in ourselves. See, we have reptilian brain, we have mammalian brain, we have primate brain. We have these three brain layers. So the evolutionary wisdom is encoded in the mammalian and the reptilian brain. The reptiles are our oldest layers of our brain, of our oldest layers of our evolutionary knowledge. And what is that? It's the knowledge of how to live on this earth. This is what, so the tree, I believe that the original story of the tree of knowledge was the exact opposite. See, the story that we get is don't eat of the fruit of the tree. Originally it was do eat of the fruit of the tree. And when you do eat, you will have knowledge. That's precisely what you need to do. And among the knowledge that we have to have that we gain by eating is the knowledge of what is good to eat and what's not good to eat. I think eating the fruit of the tree has much more to do with eating than it does with sex. In other words, it's less symbolic than we've come to believe. Because how do we learn? How did primitive human beings, how did early human beings learn what they could eat and what was poisonous? They learned it from watching the animals. How else? And in that story, it's very interesting, as you find it in the Bible, because it's a very weird story, because God, Yahweh, actually lies. Isn't that a story, an interesting story, that God in your Bible lies? He says to humans, don't eat of that tree, because on the day that you eat of that tree, you will die. The serpent comes along and says, no, you won't die. Instead, you'll know. So God lied, and the serpent was right, because they ate the tree, they didn't die. Isn't that weird when you think about it? But the priests, you see, who wrote that story, they wanted to establish a religion in which people no longer worship the old nature spirits, no longer worship the old goddess, no longer worship serpents, communicated with nature spirits, communicated with animals, golden calf and so forth, and only followed this Yahweh God, who's a lawgiver God, established all the laws that you read in the book of Deuteronomy, all the laws, the rules and regulations. And women had to be kept in their place. Women were definitely subordinate. They were slaves, basically. Women were slaves in those societies. So the whole book of Genesis is, in one way, a religious justification for a slavery system. And in the Christian view, then, the tree of knowledge became identified as the tree of death. And Adam and Eve led us into the first sin, and then Christ, was the second Adam who was supposed to redeem us from that first original sin. Now, interesting thing is this is the classical image of the tree. The tree of life is also the image used in biology to describe the evolution of life, from simple forms of life to more and more complex forms of life. And usually you see the human being portrayed at the pinnacle or the crown of the tree after having evolved all these animal species from simple to more and more complex and so forth. That's been sort of the traditional view of the tree of life in biology, evolutionary biology. But it's very interesting that there are many, many trees which don't look like that at all. There are many, many trees that look like that. They have 2 trunks or 3 trunks or 5 trunks. Not one trunk with many branches, but many trunks, multi-trunk trees. They're actually equally common as single-trunk trees. You'd be amazed. It has to do with perception. We're so fixated on this view. I would suggest to you, if you've never done it, go out in the woods somewhere, anywhere around here in the Bay Area, and start looking for trees with many trunks. You'd amaze yourself how many you would see. And what I think interesting about that is the fact that this is the new evolutionary view of the tree of life. This is from Lynn Margulis' book, who's Lovelock's collaborator, of what she calls the 5 kingdoms. And the 5 kingdoms, sometimes she draws it like a hand. We usually think of the 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of plants and the kingdom of animals. First of all, she says there are 3, because the fungi, like the mushrooms and so forth, are not really either plants or animals. They're a completely different life form. So there are 3 of the later developed kingdoms of life, the fungi, animals, and plants, which you see at the top there. Below them are what she called the protoctists, or some people call protista, which are single-celled organisms. A eukaryotic single-celled organism with a true nucleus. And that kingdom, of course, still continues. It's not like that once existed and historically and it's now gone. They still exist, single-celled organisms like amoebas and paramecia, so forth, are still going strong all over the world. And below that are the eukaryotic, the prokaryotic organisms, single-cell organisms that don't have a true nucleus, that don't have sexual reproduction, and the bacteria, or she calls Monera. And if you take the entire evolutionary sequence of life on Earth, say like 5 billion years, well, for the first 3 billion years, Monera was all there is. So the biggest evolutionary step is actually the step from the Monera to the Protoctista, from the bacteria to the single cells, from the prokaryotes to the eukaryotes. Because the prokaryotes invented all the basic processes of oxidation, respiration, photosynthesis, fermentation, all the basic biochemical processes which they still carry out in our skin, in our hair, in our guts, in our eyes, by the billions and the billions and the billions, and they'll probably continue to do so long after all animals are gone from this world. From their point of view, we're just the carriers, you know? We're like the aircraft carriers of this, to us, completely invisible world. And it has nothing to do with disease, but disease-carrying bacteria is only one very small group of them. So it's a multi-stem tree with no value judgment. And the later is not necessarily better. The later is younger, that's all. The human being is not the most evolved species. The human being is the youngest species. If you look around you at almost any animal or plant species around you that you will see, there are none that are any younger than the human. We're the babes in the woods. You look at the dog, the cat, well, they're 40 million years old, 50 million years old. The whales, 60 million years old. The reptiles, 250 million years old. The frogs and toads, they go really far back, way, way back. Hundreds of millions of years. We've been around a couple of million, that's it. We're babes in the woods. There's another reason why, intuitively, the early cultures had tremendous respect. It's like having respect for your elders, We really don't know anything. We know very little, and we think we know tremendous amounts. That's the arrogance of the human. So there we are, we came down from the trees onto the open savannas. But we have a memory of what it was like to live in the trees. Some people think that our ideas of freedom came from the time when we lived in the trees. When we came down from the trees into the open savanna, that was a tremendously important step, because once coming down from the savanna, then that led to the upright gait, walking upright rather than walking on all fours like an ape. That led, and it was partly because we needed to see, being able to see predators, threatenings far away, and that by standing upright we could see better. Also, it freed up then the hand to carry things, not just to pick up a club and beat somebody, which is a kind of usual idea of the caveman, but to carry things, like to carry fruit, or to. Some people now think that the first tool was not an axe, but rather was a gourd, a hollowed-out gourd with which you could carry water, or little fruits and nuts and seeds and stuff like that you gathered. So anyway, many fateful processes followed from this walking upright, seeing far, carrying things, developing the opposable thumb. Many people feel that human beings has gotten into trouble, not so much because of the big brain. Clearly the big brain had something to do with it. We've developed these big brains and with which we're able to become very smart and figure things out. But then dolphins and whales have big brains, and relative to body sizes bigger than ours. They don't seem to have that same kind of disturbed relationship to their environment that we do. But it's the combination of the big brain and the opposable thumb. Dolphins and whales can't make anything. They can't fiddle around and produce things with their hands. They can't stick and poke and hit and throw. Of course, which is all the great glory of the human too, the art and the creativity, but also enables us to make bombs and rifles and guns and swords and clubs and weapons and so forth. So an early family encounter group here. So I was saying that some people feel that our ideas of freedom may come from this notion of this life in the trees, where you were able to move in 3 dimensions, forward and back, left and right, and up and down. And you got 5 limbs instead of 4. Pretty amazing. Fly like a bird. So then, once we go back we're going back in the ancestral sequence. So the primates, the hominids, the pre-hominids, the primates, and the mammals. Now, among the mammals and all forms of animals, you have this very basic division of species between predator and prey. Predator, hunter, prey. Now, predator and prey have a different kind of consciousness. And for hundreds of millions of years, predators and prey species co-evolve. They're actually symbiotically related. The prey animals, for example, learn to run faster and faster to get away. The predator animals have to learn to run faster and faster to catch them. So they support each other's evolution in terms of speed. But in terms of the consciousness or the quality of perception and attention, it's different. The perception of the predatory animal, like the hunter, is insistent and persistent and focused, narrow focus. Think of a wolf or a dog tracking, stalking, tracking. It's a narrow focus thing and persistence, and then of course speed. And the prey animals is wide focus. The perception, the attention is wide focus. It's being able to look all around. Think about the image of the deer at a watering hole, looking all around, or swiveling its ears all around to pick up sound from every direction, because the predator animal might come from any direction. So it's very cautious and circumspect, which means looking all around, right? Circumspection. So these 2 forms of consciousness, as well as the feeling of being a predator and a prey, are deeply ingrained in human nature. And the pattern, and we see the pattern in human beings in what's called the victim and the aggressor, what Fritz Perls called the top dog and the underdog. People feel victimized, they feel they're being preyed upon. We even use that language. We use that language in the business world. We use that language in interpersonal relationship, in the relationship between the sexes, predatory relationships, the business world certainly, international relationships. Stealing, is a predatory relationship. Banditry, stealing is predatory. Murder, of course. The feeling of being victimized, being a victim, being victimized, being pursued. The kind of extreme of prey-victim development is paranoia. Cautiousness, accelerated or intensified to the level of paranoia. The extreme of the predatory hunting attitude is sociopathic gangsterism, killing, murdering, violence, destructive, robbing, that kind of thing. So it's possible, however, to cultivate and develop both these forms of consciousness, because both are valid and useful, valuable forms of consciousness, perception, and attention, and separate them from the emotional attitudes and from the behaviors. We can even, there are spiritual practices. You've read the books of Castaneda, where he talks about being like a hunter, like stalking wisdom, or the circumspection and openness and receptivity of the typical prey animal would be like a receptivity and openness to unusual and very subtle kinds of stimulus. See, the prey animals are more sensitive. They pick up very low sounds and very subtle sights and very subtle scents that others don't pick up. Because the ones that had that greater sensitivity were the ones that survived. So going back behind the mammals, then we get to the reptiles, the turtles, the lizards, the serpents, and so forth. And it's interesting to reflect, and we don't have the time to do this now in detail, but just to reflect about what are the different qualities that we learn from these. You know, the reptilian brain in the brain stem of the human being deals with territory, ritualistic behavior. They don't have feelings. You know, family behavior, parent-child bonding and family, social behavior is all, you find that in mammals, you don't find it in reptiles. Reptiles are as likely to eat their young as take care of them. You know, anything that moves, eat it. Sometimes it's occurred to me that some forms of child abuse might be seen as a kind of atavistic regression to a reptilian stage. Because mammals don't abuse their children. Primates don't abuse their children. So it's a stress-related atavistic regression. Anyway, back behind the reptiles, then you get to the amphibians, the ones that live right at the water's edge. They've got the best of both worlds, or all three worlds: earth, land, and air. Sea, earth, and air. And then back to the fish in the sea. Now the fish were the ones that invented vertebrate structure. A vertebrate structure with a head at one end and a tail at the other, mouth and eyes at the head end and tail at the other, is what we inherit from the fish. We still have that. That was the first big evolutionary advance in the animal kingdom. And in Hindu mythology, or the incarnations of Vishnu, the first of the 10 incarnations of Vishnu is as a fish. The second is as a turtle, a reptile. The third is as a lion, a mammal. But then before the vertebrates, you had all the invertebrates, the sponges and mollusks and anemones and all those amazing forms of the sea. These are also our ancestors, hard though it may be to believe sometimes. And the single-celled organisms that still live in us. After all, we each started off life, every life, even this personal life, as a single-celled organism. And in many forms of newer transpersonal and experiential psychotherapy, people find that they can relive the consciousness of birth and prenatal existence and moment of conception. So some people have suggested that all the myths of the little people that live under the earth may be mythological kind of symbolizations of some of this small life, you know, the small life forms of plants and small animals and so forth that live in the humus under the soil, in the earth. The dwarves, the elves, the little people, the leprechauns, and their great Pan, the lord of vegetation, lord of the animals. And back to the Orishas, the Afro-Brazilian gods of power. In these African and other shamanic animistic cultures, there's much less of this notion of good and evil that you find in the Judeo and Christian and monotheistic religions. I mean, they don't seem to have that. They have these forces of gods and goddesses that are that sometimes will express both constructive and destructive, or but more often they're neutral. They express a power, an energy, a force, like a volcano or a hurricane or a storm. They express the energies of the natural world. The good and evil is not it doesn't exist in nature, actually. It's a human concept. It's a human division. I think the story of is another distortion of the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It was the tree of knowledge. It was not of all dualities, not just good and evil, all dualities. And sensory knowledge, knowledge that comes in through the senses, is dualistic. There's no two ways about it. So shamanic cultures have these images of spirits, gods and goddesses that are blends of animals and humans. These are the kinds of visions that shamanic practitioners might see in their inner journeys, where a very close teaching and healing relationship is established and cultivated between the human and the animal species. You find that also in the old Mesopotamian religions, gods and deities with animal heads, showing quite a different relationship. Clearly the human is not seen as superior to the animal. Pacific Northwest Coast Indian mask blends of human, spirit, and animal forms. Again, showing the close interconnection of all aspects, all realms of the natural world, the plant, the animal. That's why the Indian cultures they use feathers, shells, bones, hide, leather, all the products of the animal in the natural world for clothing and adornment. The green man is a kind of a European, British Isles folkloric figure who's sort of a relic of the old god of the forests and the vegetation. Christian Christ figure as the solar Christ figure. So even in Christianity, some of the old mythology has a place. And then all the spirits of a place, places that were focused or marked by stone henges, megalithic stone places that seem to have a particular kind of spiritual energy that facilitated heightened forms of perception or consciousness. Serpent Mound in Ohio. Seeing rocks that seem to have animal shapes. You see the turtle head. The place under the earth where you gather together for a council meeting around a fire, to be in the body of the earth. In the 18th and 19th century, the Romantic movement in Europe was drawn particularly to wild places and wild and stormy places, and they were thought of to be places of a special inspiration, to creative inspiration for poets and painters and musicians. Sacred mountains, as among the Buddhists in Japan, Tibet, China. But mountains also as places where castles or chapels are built, and also fortifications are built. Like in this medieval castle on the Rhine, with walls 8 meters thick, truly a monument to paranoia. So you wall yourself up and stick in the mountain so you can see the bad guys coming. So this is from a reconstruction of a fortified hillside from 3000 BC. So the pre-Indo-European cultures didn't build fortified hillsides, hill forts. They didn't have warfare, they didn't have weapons, they didn't have fortification, they didn't need walls. But with the Indo-Europeans then setting up forts, and these were warrior tribes, so then you get the beginning of warfare. This is right out here in Marin County, an example of the demonization of nature. All over the western and eastern parts of the United States, you will find powerful natural places referred to as the devil's something or other. The devil's punch bowl, the devil's elbow, the devil's gulch. It's a relic of the demonization of the nature. A place that's simply powerful is seen as demonic. Of course, we don't believe in devils anymore, but then why do we call it that name, you know? This is Devil's Gulch. Looks threatening, doesn't it? So the Amazonian rainforest where I recently was. I'd like to just give you some images of places where I've been, different parts of the world. The Black Forest, a forest scene that's been managed, but in an ecologically sensitive way now for many centuries. Kind of a very smooth and protective integration of the human with the forest. Point Reyes, Salt Point. This is the view out of the back of our house. Okay, so could we turn on the light?
Thank you, Ralph.
Well, maybe somebody could. Question or
Just what? How would you compare deep ecology with transpersonal psychology in just a few minutes?
Well, see, my view is that what I call, we don't have what I would call really an ecological psychology or green psychology. That's why I said in this workshop is towards, one of the things I want to look at is like what would be the features of a really green ecological psychology. I don't think any of the main schools of psychology have it. Humanistic doesn't have it. Psychoanalytic doesn't have it. Behaviorism doesn't have it. And transpersonal doesn't have it either. Transpersonal psychology is mostly concerned with spiritual states of consciousness. The closest that any of these forms of psychology come to nature is through body work. Our bodies are part of nature, and if you go into and in altered states of consciousness, like with psychedelic drugs, people can experience unusual bodily states, and they can experience unusual forms of communication with an animal or plant species. But there's no real understanding of what that means. There's no real examination of the attitudes that people hold towards nature. There's no questioning of what it really means that we're animals living on this earth. You'll never find the word earth mentioned in the index of any psychology book. Never. Never. Our psychology could as well be people of Mars, and that doesn't make any difference.